There is a secret I want you to carry into this story. You are cared for here, truly deeply cared for. We don't say this lightly. You matter more than you know, and your presence right now is a quiet gift. This story is meant to hold you, to soften you, to remind you of gentleness that still exists in the world. We love you for choosing to spend your night here. Before we begin, tell us, where in the world are you listening from and what time is it there? Now take a deep breath, grab your coffee or tea, hold its warmth in your hands, and let's step into the tale together. There was a night when the multiverse leaned close and began to whisper, as if someone had walked the endless corridors between worlds and pressed a quiet hand against every door. On that night, in laboratories cluttered with forgotten inventions, in kitchens that smelled of stale coffee, in towers of glass that leaned toward stars, 1,000 small Ricks turned their faces toward the hush, not in alarm but with a strange kind of curiosity. The sound was not a warning. It was a secret sung low, the kind that makes you slow your breathing just to hear. It moved like a lullaby across impossible distances, threading through broken light and the quiet places where things remember themselves. The whisper had no single source. It came from everywhere, as if the fabric of creation had chosen for a moment to hum to itself. If you have ever leaned from a window and heard the city breathing beneath you, or walked into a forest and felt that the trees were exchanging secrets just beyond your hearing, you will know the kind of sound it was. The multiverse breathed that night, patient and steady, and the sound settled inside every Rick who was willing to pause. Not every Rick noticed. Some were too busy tinkering with machines, their heads bent toward unfinished equations. Some had filled their lives with so much noise that they could no longer hear the delicate things. But many did notice. They put down their tools, or at least slowed their hands. They tilted their heads. And in that act of listening, something remarkable began. A council not yet formalized, but already present in the very posture of attention. Picture them now. So many Ricks scattered across countless realities. Some wore coats stained with oil. Some wore coats pressed crisp as paper. A few wore none at all, sitting in pajamas with ink stains on their fingers. One kept a jar of marbles he rolled between his palms when the silence stretched too long. Another hummed old songs to himself, half remembered from childhood. They were not holy men nor saints. They were, each in their way, ordinary and flawed. But when the whisper brushed past them, each became something gentler than they had been a moment before. The sound carried with it not instructions, but memories. For some it was the echo of a rainy afternoon, when they were young and felt small but safe. For others it was the smell of bread, or the rhythm of a lullaby their mothers had once sung. A few remembered the taste of sandwiches, the way they held simple things together. These were not grand revelations. They were small, almost embarrassed truths, the kind that slip between sentences when people are tired. Yet they carried weight. The Ricks gathered, not physically, not yet, but in spirit. It was as though the whisper had stitched a thread between them, and each felt the tug. In time, that thread would pull them into the same hall, a place of mirrors and shadows and endless murmurs. But on this first night, what mattered was not architecture. What mattered was awe. They sat in their scattered worlds and felt, perhaps for the first time in years, the humility of being part of something larger than themselves. I watched them, and I say I not because I stand apart, but because every story needs a voice to carry it forward. Really, it was all of us who watched, the multiverse itself, the stars leaning closer. They were softened by the hush, the way people soften when they realize they are being sung to. Even the most hardened among them, the Ricks who drowned their hours in invention or alcohol, grew quiet. Their shoulders slackened. Their jokes faltered into silence. They became for a moment only listeners. Some resisted. They scoffed at the softness, muttered about equations that mattered more, and turned away. But even those who left carried a fragment of the sound inside them, like sand stuck in the folds of their clothing. And for those who remained, something new was born. Not an empire, not a tribunal, but a gathering of witnesses. This was the first breath of what would one day be called the Council of Ricks. Not a council of authority, but of listening. They did not name themselves that night. They did not draft rules or claim power. They simply lingered with the sound, as one lingers with steam rising from a cup, knowing it will soon dissolve but unwilling to let it go too quickly. They sat in dim rooms and on cold rooftops, looking not at each other, but at the invisible thread humming between them. It felt in its way like family, The kind of family that does not ask questions, only sits nearby when you are tired. The whisper itself never clarified its source. It never declared, "I am this" or "I am that." It remained tenderly ambiguous, like a dream that does not need decoding. But the effect was unmistakable. For years afterward, Ricks would recall the night and say they had been changed, not in dramatic ways, but in subtle ones. They grew a little slower to anger, a little quicker to notice the softness in someone's voice. They remembered how to mend a broken cup instead of throwing it away. What was it then that began that night? Some said it was the multiverse mourning its own weight. Others believed it was the echo of infinite Mortys, small voices humming together across time. Still others insisted it was nothing at all, just a trick of perception. Yet even those skeptics could not shake the memory. Whatever the truth, it was the beginning of something that would matter more than power or invention. It was the beginning of listening. And beyond all of this, beyond the 1,000 Ricks leaning into the hush, something else stirred. In a small house under a dim nightlight, a child named Morty turned in his sleep. He did not know it yet, but his life was already being woven into the fabric of that whisper. His quirks, his empathy, his hesitation, his longing for calm, would one day carry weight among giants. But for now he only dreamed softly, the way children do while the stars hummed above him. So the night passed. The whispers thinned, dissolving into the ordinary sounds of ticking clocks and buzzing machines. The Ricks returned to their rooms, though none of them quite returned unchanged. And the multiverse exhaled, as though relieved to have been heard. That was how it began, not with explosions or urgency, but with 1,000 men listening together in the quiet. A night of whispers, a night of beginnings. A night of 1,000 Ricks. There are children whose lives begin with sparks and fanfare, and there are children who enter the world quietly, almost unnoticed, like a lantern lit at dusk. Morty was one of the quiet ones. His first cries were not loud, not demanding, but soft, as though he was already reluctant to disturb the night. Even then, you could say he carried something unusual, a tendency not to take too much space, a way of blending into the hum of the world while still leaving a small, distinct glow. From the start, Morty's quirks were visible to anyone who took the time to notice. He hesitated before stepping into games with other children, not because he lacked interest, but because he seemed to feel the currents of their moods before his own. If one child was sulking in the corner, Morty would glance at them often, caught between the pull of play and the weight of someone else's sadness. It wasn't pity he felt. It was recognition, a kind of empathy that sat too heavily on small shoulders. He was not always understood. Teachers thought him distracted, parents worried he lacked confidence, and even his friends sometimes teased him for being slow to act. But Morty's hesitation wasn't weakness, it was listening. He listened to silences, to pauses, to the invisible spaces between words. Some might call that timidity. Others, if they had been wiser, would have called it tenderness. There were moments when this quiet gift revealed itself more clearly. Once, when he was very small, a bird struck the window of his family's home. The adults rushed to check the glass, the noise, the possible mess. Morty, however, slipped outside. He crouched on the grass where the bird trembled, its wings fluttering unevenly. He didn't try to fix it. He didn't even touch it at first. He simply sat beside it, his knees tucked up, his breath shallow so as not to frighten the creature further. After a long while, the bird steadied itself and flew. Morty's parents never quite knew why that moment stayed with him, but he remembered. It was his first understanding that sometimes presence was enough. Nights were where Morty's world softened most. He would lie awake in his bed, listening to the faint creak of the house, the distant hum of traffic, the occasional laughter of neighbors outside. These sounds didn't disturb him. They wrapped around him like a blanket. He found comfort in knowing that life continued, even as he drifted. And often he would imagine strange things, clouds that whispered his name, stars that bent closer just to watch him, sandwiches that floated gently through dreamlike skies, waiting to be shared. His imagination did not roar. It hummed. Morty longed for calm in a way that most children do not articulate. He disliked shouting, avoided arguments, and preferred the soft certainty of small rituals, the way his mother's tea kettle whistled each morning, the way the school bus rumbled to a stop at nearly the same time every day, the way his grandfather's shadow sometimes fell across his doorway at night, carrying the faint smell of tools and strange smoke. Morty held on to these things, collecting them like seashells in the pocket of his mind. Still, Morty was not without restlessness. His heart carried a quiet ache, though he did not yet know what name to give it. He wanted to be brave, to move forward like the children who charged ahead without pausing. He wanted to belong, but not at the cost of silencing the gentle voice within him. That voice often said, "Slow down, notice, care." And while the world often rewarded the loud and the quick, Morty kept listening inward. It was in this listening that Morty's unusual path began to take shape. The qualities that seemed small or inconvenient, his empathy, his hesitation, his longing for calm, were in truth the beginnings of something luminous. Powers in stories are often grand, explosive, and loud. Morty's power was different. His gift was the ability to absorb the emotions around him, to ease them, to turn them into something gentler. Of course, he did not yet know this. Children rarely see their quirks as gifts. They see them as oddities, as reasons to feel set apart. And Morty, too, sometimes lay awake, wondering why he felt so much so deeply, for people who barely noticed him. There were a few who did notice. A teacher once paused to thank him for comforting a classmate after a rough day. A neighbor told his parents that Morty had the kind of eyes that looked straight into you. These remarks embarrassed him, but they also stayed with him, glowing faintly in the background of his memory. Seeds not yet blossomed. As Morty grew, his childhood remained stitched together with small surreal moments. He once dreamed of stepping through a glowing circle in the middle of his room, a portal not of chaos, but of shimmering dreamlight. He awoke with his hands warm, as though the glow had been real. Another time, during a summer storm, he swore he heard the thunder speak his name, not in fear but in recognition, as though the sky itself wanted him to know he was seen. These things he never told anyone. They were too soft, too strange, but they lingered like lullabies half-remembered, and then, of course, there was Rick. Morty's grandfather was a shadow at the edge of his childhood, sometimes distant, sometimes abruptly close. Rick carried with him both mystery and melancholy, and Morty, even as a child, could sense it. He didn't understand the science, the inventions, or the strange smells that clung to Rick's clothes, but he understood the heaviness in Rick's eyes. Morty didn't always understand his words, but he understood his heart, or at least the ache that pulsed quietly within it. It was not yet time for their bond to unfold fully. For now, Rick remained a quiet presence, a figure who drifted in and out of Morty's days, like a star appearing and vanishing behind clouds. But already, Morty felt that his own softness, his own longing for calm, might one day matter to that lonely man. Already something invisible was weaving them together, so Morty's childhood stretched on, filled with hesitant steps, empathetic glances, small surreal dreams, and the ache of longing for calm in a noisy world. He did not yet know how much these traits would shape the journey ahead. But the universe knew. The whispers that had brushed against 1,000 Ricks also brushed against him. The child called Morty carried in his quiet chest the seeds of a gift the multiverse would one day need, and on some nights, when he closed his eyes and listened closely, he thought he could hear it again, the faintest hum like stars leaning closer, singing just for him. There are men who seem to belong to the earth, who live comfortably among routines and ordinary days. And there are men who seem to belong to the night sky, wandering souls who carry loneliness the way others carry tools in their pockets. Rick was one of the latter. Even before Morty could name it, he felt it. His grandfather was not merely a man of inventions, wires, and half-empty bottles. He was a presence that seemed stitched with starlight and shadow. He moved through the world as though gravity was a suggestion, not a rule, and every step he took carried the weight of distances Morty could not yet imagine. Rick was more than genius. He was a drifting constellation, a mind too vast to remain contained in one world, and yet too fractured to find peace in all of them. His hair carried the wildness of comets, his eyes the weariness of suns that had burned too long. When Morty sat with him, he sometimes felt as though he was sitting beside a universe disguised as a single man. Yet for all the brilliance that burned inside him, Rick's gestures toward Morty were quiet ones. He did not explain himself. He did not lay out his heart in words. Instead, he showed up in ways that were easy to miss unless you were paying attention. a sandwich placed silently on a plate, a tool adjusted in Morty's hand when he struggled to fit a piece together. A shadow lingering near the doorway at night, long after everyone else had gone to sleep, Morty noticed. He always noticed. His gift for listening extended beyond words, and with Rick it was essential. Rick's language was not sentences. It was fragments, sighs, and silences heavy with memory. Morty learned to hear them. At times, Rick's loneliness hung around him like a heavy coat. Morty could not always name it, but he felt it pressing into the spaces between them. It was there when Rick's gaze drifted toward the stars, his expression unreadable. It was there when he sat with a drink in his hand, staring at nothing, as though the silence might reveal something if he stared long enough. It was there in the way he sometimes laughed too loud, as if to cover a sound only he could hear, but it was also there in gentler ways. In the pauses before Rick answered Morty's questions, when he seemed to weigh whether the boy was ready for the truth, in the strange patience he sometimes showed, unexpected from a man so restless, in the rare moments when his hand rested lightly on Morty's shoulder, steadying him not just physically but emotionally too. Morty never thought of Rick as a hero. Heroes belonged in other people's stories, with banners and applause. Rick was something else entirely, part teacher, part wanderer, part ghost. Yet Morty felt drawn to him, as though some part of his own softness had been waiting for Rick's jagged edges to appear. The bond between them was not forged in grand declarations, but in the simplest of exchanges. Morty would linger in the garage, watching Rick tinker with impossible machines. Sometimes hours passed in silence, punctuated only by the hum of tools and the occasional muttered curse. To anyone else it might have seemed distant, even cold. But Morty understood. Those hours were gifts. Rick allowed him into a world no one else could enter, and that in its quiet way was love. At night, when Morty lay in bed, he thought about his grandfather. Not in the way children often think of family, with expectation of bedtime stories or lessons, but with a kind of wonder. Rick felt like both mystery and belonging. He was flawed, certainly. He was restless, often harsh, and carried habits Morty did not understand. But beneath all of that, Morty felt the hum of something steady, like the stars themselves, a presence that had been there long before him and would remain long after. Sometimes, Morty imagined Rick as a star-walker, drifting across constellations no one else could name. He pictured him stepping through invisible doors, carrying loneliness in one hand and invention in the other, searching not for conquest but for understanding. And sometimes, in his dreams, Morty saw himself at Rick's side, not as a partner in brilliance but as a companion in silence. There were glimpses, even then, of what their bond might become. Once, when Morty scraped his knee badly, Rick said nothing at first. He simply sat beside him, pulled a small bottle from his pocket and dabbed at the wound with unexpected gentleness. "Hurts less after a while," he muttered, as if speaking more to himself than to Morty. That moment lingered with Morty longer than the pain did. It was not the healing that mattered, but the presence, the simple fact that Rick stayed. Another time, Morty overheard Rick humming quietly while he worked. The tune was unfamiliar, fragile, like something half-remembered from a dream. Morty never asked what it was. He only stored it away as children often do, treasuring it as a secret glimpse of a man who seemed too large for one world. Their bond grew in shadows, in gestures, in silence. Rick was a grandfather not of bedtime stories, but of stars, distant, luminous, and carrying a loneliness Morty could feel even when it was unspoken. Yet in that loneliness, Morty also sensed something else, the possibility of connection. Rick might never say the words aloud, but Morty could hear them in the spaces between, and so quietly, without either of them naming it, they began to belong to one another. Not through declarations, but through presence. Not through perfection, but through the small, almost unnoticed ways love reveals itself when it is too fragile to speak. Rick was the grandfather of stars, and Morty, in his softness, became the one who listened to the silence between them. Dreams often begin without a doorway. They start as a color or a sound, or the simple knowledge that you are somewhere other than where you laid your head. Morty's dream that night began with light. Not the harsh light of lamps or the sudden flare of lightning, but a gentle shimmer, as though the air itself had decided to glow. It began at the corner of his room. The wallpaper softened, edges blurred, and then the glow gathered. Hannah forming a circle that pulsed like a quiet breath. It was not loud, not frightening. It hummed the way lullabies hum, the kind of sound that lives under the skin, steady and calm. Morty sat up in bed, rubbing his eyes, but the glow did not vanish. It deepened, shimmering with colors he could not name, a portal. He did not know the word yet, not in the way his grandfather did. To Morty it was a dreamlight, a window into somewhere else. He did not think of danger, did not imagine monsters or chaos. Instead, he felt the pull of curiosity, like a tide urging him forward. Children know when something is meant for them, even if they cannot explain why, and Morty knew this light was not here to frighten him. It was here to invite. He slipped from his bed, bare feet soft against the floor. The air around the portal was cool, almost dewy, like morning grass. He reached out a hand, half expecting it to pass through nothing. But when his fingertips brushed the edge, the shimmer rippled outward, spreading in gentle circles like water disturbed by a pebble. Morty laughed quietly, not from humor but from awe. The dream pulled him further. He stepped through. On the other side, the world was not chaos, it was wonder. The ground beneath him was soft, like sand that remembered the ocean. The sky was alive with drifting lights, not stars, not fireflies, but something in between. They floated lazily, glowing brighter when Morty looked at them, dimming when he glanced away as if shy. The air tasted faintly of sweetness, like bread just out of the oven. Morty wandered, his heart steady. He did not feel the anxiety that usually clung to him in waking life. Here everything seemed to accept him as he was, hesitant, gentle, listening. Even the lights above seemed to bend closer, humming faintly in tones that matched the rhythm of his breath. At a distance he saw shapes, mountains perhaps, or clouds that had forgotten to float. He did not rush toward them. He only walked slowly, noticing the way the ground shifted color beneath each step. Pale blues giving way to soft pinks, then fading into silver. He bent down once and touched it, half expecting it to crumble like dust. Instead it felt warm as though it held memory. This was no ordinary dream. Morty felt it in his bones. He knew, without knowing how, that this shimmering place was connected to something larger, to Rick, to the whispers, to the strange hum that sometimes filled the edges of his life. Yet he did not feel overwhelmed. He felt accompanied, as though unseen hands guided him, not to control but to comfort. He tried speaking just to test the air. "Hello!" His voice came out softer than expected, but the dream answered, not with words but with a gentle shift of light. A nearby glow swelled brighter, then floated toward him, hovering at eye level. Morty smiled. "You're listening, huh?" The glow pulsed once, as if in reply. He walked with it for a time. It circled him, playful but never demanding. Morty thought of it as a friend, though it had no face, no name. Sometimes in childhood, all it takes to feel less alone is the sense that something, anything, is walking beside you. This glow gave him that gift. After a while, Morty grew tired. Not the heavy tiredness of exhaustion, but the gentle kind that comes after a long, full day. He lay down on the strange ground, the glow hovering close. Above him, the lights in the sky drifted slower, their hum softening into something like a lullaby. Morty closed his eyes, his breathing easy. He felt no fear of being lost, no dread of waking. Only peace. When he opened his eyes again, he was back in his room. The portal shimmered faintly for a moment longer, then folded into nothing, leaving only the ordinary dark. The air was still cool, the sheets still warm. For a while Morty lay awake, staring at the ceiling. Part of him wanted to tell someone. But he knew somehow that this was his dream to keep, for now. The memory of the glow lingered. In days to come, when school felt loud or his own hesitation felt too heavy, Morty would recall the shimmer and steady himself. He would think of the ground that shifted colors, of the glow that walked beside him, of the lullaby hidden in the sky. And each time he felt less afraid of the strangeness that was beginning to gather at the edges of his life. Later, when Rick began to open portals of his own, wild, chaotic, reckless things, Morty would remember his first portal not as chaos but as comfort. He would carry that memory like a lantern, proof that not every doorway is dangerous, that sometimes stepping through leads to wonder, and that wonder itself can be a kind of strength. The dream had not given him answers. It had given him something softer, trust. Trust that he could face the unknown without trembling. Trust that within strangeness there could be peace. Trust that even in the multiverse's endless shifting, there might always be a place where light hums just for him. And as he drifted back into sleep, Morty whispered a small thank you, not sure to whom or to what, perhaps to the glow, perhaps to the stars, perhaps to the quiet part of himself that had chosen to step through. The night held him gently, and the boy who longed for calm dreamed on. The first time Morty heard about the council, it was not through Rick's impatient explanations or the sharp crackle of a portal gun. It came instead like a shadow slipping beneath a door, subtle and quiet. Rick had not spoken much that evening. His eyes had been tired, his hands restless. Morty could tell when his grandfather was keeping something to himself. It was in the way he avoided Morty's gaze, in the way his words came out clipped and careless. They traveled anyway, a shimmer, a step, a shift of air. Morty had learned not to expect answers before the journey began. He followed, as always, his trust tethered to the strange balance of fear and comfort that came with being beside Rick. The portal opened onto a place unlike the glowing dreamscape Morty had once wandered. This was not made of colors that shifted like size. This place was made of silence. The hall stretched endlessly, its floor dark and reflective as if the stars themselves had been pressed flat beneath glass. Shadows leaned against one another, not oppressive but patient, as though they had been waiting a very long time. At the far edges, Morty thought he saw figures countless and shifting, but when he blinked they blended back into the dim. Rick walked forward as though he had been here many times before. His coat swayed, his steps unhurried, but his eyes darted, flicking between faces that Morty could not quite see. Then Morty realized they were all Rick, rows and rows, seated in silence, their silhouettes familiar yet strange. Each one carried some echo of his grandfather, the hunched shoulders, the restless hands, the eyes that knew too much. And yet, none were exactly the same. Some leaned heavily on canes, their movements slow and weary. Others looked younger, sharper, eyes flashing with a different kind of intelligence. One sat with arms folded tightly, refusing to look at anyone. Another traced patterns in the air as though lost in thought. The Council of Ricks. Morty expected noise, arguments, perhaps even laughter. But the gathering was not loud. It was quiet, almost reverent, as though they were a congregation waiting for a hymn to begin. Their voices, when they did speak, were low and measured, filling the hall like the hum of distant machinery. Morty stayed close to Rick, his small hand brushing against his grandfather's sleeve. "What is this place?" he whispered. Rick did not answer right away. He stared at the rows of his own faces, his mouth set in a thin line. Finally he said, "It's us, every version of me that thought it mattered to gather. A council." Morty nodded slowly, though the explanation carried more weight than clarity. He tried to imagine being in a room full of himself, every possible choice, every possible version, sitting side by side. The thought unsettled him, yet the silence of the hall softened it. The strangeness did not feel sharp. It felt like fog, heavy but calm. The Ricks began to murmur among themselves. Their words were not debates so much as layered thoughts, drifting across one another. Morty caught fragments, ethics, equations, loss, memory. The tones were subdued, but beneath them Morty felt something else, loneliness. It clung to the edges of their voices, the way shadows cling to the corners of a room. Rick's jaw tightened. Morty wondered if he heard it too. Then slowly the whole shifted. Not the structure, but the feeling. Morty realized the silence was not empty. It was attentive. Dozens of eyes had turned toward him. Not toward Rick, but toward Morty himself. He froze, his heart quickening. Yet the stares did not burn. They weighed. They studied. As though each Rick saw something in him that Morty himself had not yet discovered. Rick placed a hand lightly on Morty's shoulder, a rare gesture of reassurance. "Ignore it," he muttered, though his tone carried less command and more weariness. They liked to stare, but Morty did not ignore it. He held their gazes, uncomfortable at first, then curious. For the first time, he wondered if his presence meant something here, if he was more than a quiet shadow trailing after his grandfather. The Council of Rick seemed to think so, even if Rick himself would not say it aloud. The session went on, though Morty could not follow most of the words. They spoke of structures between worlds, of anomalies, of choices made and unmade. The phrases floated past him like half-remembered dreams, and yet he understood something deeper. They were afraid. Not in the way children fear monsters, but in the way weary souls fear themselves. Morty glanced up at Rick. His grandfather's face betrayed little, but Morty noticed the smallest flicker of emotion. A tightening at the corner of his mouth, a shadow in his eyes. Rick was not immune to the weight of the hall. At length the voices dimmed. One Rick, older and slower than the rest, raised his head. His eyes landed on Morty, then softened. "He doesn't belong here," the elder Rick murmured. "But perhaps he's why we do." The words settled in the hall like dust, quiet and steady. No one argued. No one laughed. They let the thought linger, its meaning stretching further than Morty could grasp. Rick exhaled, low and sharp. He turned away, tugging Morty gently toward the portal. "That's enough for one night." Morty did not resist. He followed, though his mind buzzed with the strangeness of it all. As they stepped back through the shimmer, leaving the Hall of Shadows behind, Morty felt the silence follow him, clinging like a soft echo. Later, lying in his bed, he tried to replay the images, the countless Ricks, the reflective floor, the voices that spoke like lullabies of worry. He remembered especially the stare of the elder Rick, the way his words had curled around Morty like a blanket. "He doesn't belong here. But perhaps he is why we do." Morty held on to those words. He did not fully understand them, but he felt their weight. And in that weight, he sensed a truth. Even among infinite Ricks, even in halls made of shadows, there was space for him. The thought soothed him as sleep returned, carrying him into dreams softer than silence. When Morty woke the next morning, the memory of the council still lingered in his chest, like a weight he could not shake off. The reflective floor, the silent eyes, the older Rick's words, it all pressed against him, soft yet steady. He turned them over like stones in his pocket, not sharp enough to cut, but heavy enough to feel with every step. Rick, of course, pretended nothing had happened. He clattered in the kitchen, rummaging for tools instead of breakfast, muttering half-sentences that evaporated before Morty could ask what they meant. Morty had learned long ago that Rick carried silence like armor. He would fill the air with noise just to keep certain truths hidden. But Morty also knew how to listen differently, not to the words, but to the spaces between them. And in those spaces he could hear Rick's unease. That was the first time Morty realized his quiet might be its own kind of strength. It wasn't dramatic. No sudden revelation, no blinding light, just a small noticing that when Rick grew restless, Morty's stillness mattered. He did not argue. He did not press for explanations. He just stayed, absorbing the turbulence until it softened around them. They traveled again that day, stepping through another portal. This one opened onto a sky made of woven clouds, white and luminous, stretched like fabric across an endless horizon. The ground below was smooth and glassy, reflecting everything above, so that when Morty looked down, he felt as though he were walking on the underside of heaven. Rick busied himself with readings, muttering about coordinates and calibrations. Morty wandered a few steps away, letting the quiet air press cool against his skin. He lay back, watching the mirrored clouds ripple beneath him. That was when he felt it. Not sound, not sight, but a weight in the air. Someone else's unease. He sat up and saw another Morty, sitting cross-legged a short distance away. This Morty's hair was slightly longer, his eyes darker with fatigue. His shoulders slumped as though carrying an invisible burden. The two Mortys looked at each other. Neither spoke at first. Then the other Morty whispered, "Do you ever feel like you're only here to be hurt?" The word struck Morty in a way no lecture or threat ever had. He swallowed, unsure what to say, but instead of answering quickly, he let the silence stretch, soft and unbroken. He met the other Morty's gaze, not with pity, but with patience. Something shifted. The darker-eyed Morty's shoulders eased just slightly. The tension leaked out of him like air from a balloon. Morty realized he had not solved anything. He had not offered a plan or a fix. All he had done was hold space for the words, let them land without resistance. And somehow that mattered. Later, when Rick returned to him, Morty asked nothing about the strange encounter. He carried it quietly, like the council's words before. And he noticed how when Rick snapped at him absent-mindedly, Morty did not snap back. Instead, he softened, and Rick's anger passed quicker than it might have otherwise. The pattern grew over time. When they landed on a world made entirely of echoing stone, Morty listened to the echoes longer than Rick did, hearing how they bent and carried feelings, not just sounds. When they stumbled through a dimension where the air hummed with sadness, Morty felt it first, not in his ears, but in his chest, and his calmness steadied Rick's impatience. It became clear to him slowly that while Rick's gift was brilliance, the kind that could slice through puzzles and bend the multiverse into new shapes, Morty's gift was something softer. He could feel what others did not want to admit, and in feeling it he could ease it. He thought back often to the council of Ricks, to all those eyes turned toward him. Perhaps they had seen this in him. Perhaps that was why they had stared so intently. He was not another Rick, not another voice clamoring to be heard. He was different, and his difference was needed. One evening back home, Morty sat on the porch with Rick. The stars were out, scattered across the night like crumbs on a tablecloth. Rick drank from a flask, silent for once, his shoulders bent against the weight of thoughts Morty could not name. Morty didn't speak either. He simply sat, hands folded in his lap, breathing slowly. After a while, Rick sighed, long, deep, almost relieved. He didn't look at Morty, but his voice softened just enough when he said, "You're good at that, you know. Just sitting there makes it easier." Morty felt warmth in his chest. It wasn't much, just a handful of words, but it was more than enough. He understood then that his quiet was not emptiness, it was presence. And presence in a world of noise and chaos could be its own kind of power. That night, as Morty drifted into sleep, he dreamed not of portals or machines, but of sitting beside countless versions of himself, each one breathing calmly together. Their silence filled the dream like music, steady and soothing, carrying him into deeper rest. The next journey began in a hush. Rick said little as he adjusted the portal gun, and Morty, used to his grandfather's moods, didn't press for explanation. The shimmer opened on a landscape that was neither vibrant nor broken, but soft, almost ordinary. Rolling hills stretched out beneath a sky tinted with lavender dusk, and small lanterns floated in the air, as though guided by invisible strings. The world seemed to breathe slower, its rhythm steady like a lullaby drawn long. They walked across the grass in silence. Rick muttered about a rendezvous, his words clipped and low. Morty kept his hands in his pockets, feeling the cool blades brush against his legs. It was only when they reached a wooden house at the top of a hill that Morty noticed something unusual. Rick knocked on the door. A Rick opened it. He looked like every Rick Morty had seen before, and yet not at all. His hair was still wild, though streaked more deeply with grey. His coat was worn at the elbows, patched not with machines but with thread. And when he looked at them, his gaze did not dart restlessly. It lingered calm and steady, like someone who had learned to wait. "Come in," this Rick said simply, his voice even and kind. Morty stepped inside before his grandfather did, curious. The house smelled faintly of bread and wood smoke. Books lined the shelves, not schematics but stories, some thick with dust, others folded open as though read often. A kettle hissed gently on the stove, steam curling in the dim light. Morty's Rick frowned, already restless. "Didn't come here for tea, other me." The other Rick only smiled. "Maybe you didn't, but he might appreciate it." His eyes flicked toward Morty. Morty felt seen in a way he hadn't expected. Not as a sidekick, not as someone trailing behind genius, but as himself they sat. The kettle poured into small cups, the warmth wrapping around Morty's fingers. He breathed in the steam, surprised by how it calmed him. This Rick, Morty thought of him as the listening Rick, asked questions, but not the usual kind. Not about science or anomalies. He asked Morty how he slept after their travels, if he ever grew tired of running, what he remembered most about home. Morty answered slowly, unsure at first, then with more ease. The listening Rick nodded, never interrupting, never rushing. When Morty's words faltered, he let the silence rest until Morty found them again. It felt new and strangely healing. His own Rick grew restless, tapping fingers on the table, shifting in his seat. "This is pointless," he muttered. "He doesn't need coddling." But the listening Rick didn't argue. He turned his gaze toward his counterpart and said quietly, "He doesn't need fixing either. Sometimes he only needs someone to notice him." The words settled heavily in the air. Morty's Rick looked away, lips pressed thin. Morty, meanwhile, felt a warmth rise in his chest. He had never thought of his quietness as something worth noticing. But this Rick saw it. The evening stretched long, filled not with plans or devices, but with gentle talk. They spoke of stars, not equations, of memories, not strategies. The listening Rick told Morty that in some universes, Ricks forget how to listen, but that didn't mean listening was lost forever. "It's a choice," he said softly, "and choices matter more than inventions." Morty carried that sentence like a lantern in his mind. When the time came to leave, Morty hesitated at the doorway. He wanted to stay a little longer, to breathe more of the quiet air, to be held in the warmth of being heard. The listening Rick crouched to meet his eyes and placed a hand gently on his shoulder. "Remember, Morty, your presence is already enough. Don't let anyone make you believe otherwise." Morty nodded, his throat tight with unspoken gratitude. Back through the portal they went. The lavender sky faded, replaced by the flicker of neon lights outside their garage. Rick tossed tools onto the table with a huff, already burying himself in noise. But Morty lingered at the threshold, still carrying the calm weight of what he'd learned. That night, lying in bed, he repeated the listening Rick's words to himself. "Your presence is already enough." They became a lullaby of their own, looping softly until sleep took him, and somewhere, in a quiet house on a lavender hill, a Rick still waited with tea on the stove, listening for anyone who needed to be heard. The next journey felt slower from the start. Even the portal shimmered less brightly, its edges soft as though the light itself were tired. Rick hardly spoke as they crossed through. His footsteps dragged, his shoulders slouched beneath the weight of thoughts Morty couldn't name. When Morty blinked on the other side, he found himself standing in a place that seemed neither alive nor empty. The air shimmered faintly, as though the world had been painted with watercolors and left unfinished. A field stretched out in muted gold, and at the far end stood a lone tree, branches bent low but steady. Beneath the tree sat a boy. Morty squinted, his chest tightening. The boy was himself, or almost. This Morty's hair was the same, his clothes familiar, but his posture was different. He sat cross-legged, his hands resting calmly on his knees, eyes half closed as though waiting for something beyond time. Rick barely looked up. He muttered something about temporal interference and wandered toward a cluster of faint machinery humming in the distance. Morty, however, felt pulled toward the tree. He walked slowly, the grass brushing against his legs, the silence heavy but not suffocating. When he reached the boy, he hesitated. "Hey," Morty said quietly. The other Morty opened his eyes. They were calm, steady, deeper than mirrors. "I've been waiting," he replied. As though it explained everything, Morty frowned. "For me?" "Yes, for as long as I can remember." The word stirred something inside him, unease but also wonder. He sat down across from his counterpart, the bark of the tree cool against his back. The stillness between them stretched, but unlike the silences Morty knew from his own world, this one did not feel awkward. It felt chosen. After a while, Morty asked, "What are you waiting for?" The other Morty tilted his head slightly, a small smile tugging at his lips. "For you to understand." "Understand what?" "That sometimes waiting is its own kind of power. Everyone else rushes. Everyone else runs. But if you wait, the world shows itself differently. Time unfolds softer." Morty blinked, unsure how to respond. His mind flickered to his grandfather, always moving, always building, always restless. And then to himself, always following, often stumbling, rarely pausing. The idea of waiting felt strange, almost impossible. But here, beneath the tree, it didn't feel impossible. It felt natural. The two Mortys sat in quiet together, breath sinking without effort. The sun above shifted, not hurriedly but gently, sliding across the sky like a slow heartbeat. Morty felt the weight of his body settle more deeply into the earth, as if the ground were holding him in place. At last, the other Morty spoke again. "You don't need to be louder to matter. You don't need to run faster. Sometimes being still is the only way to see clearly." Morty swallowed hard. The words reminded him of the listening Rick, of the council's silent eyes, of all the moments where his quietness had made a difference. Yet this Morty gave it a new shape, not just quiet but waiting. A strange peace washed over him, soft and steady. He realized this Morty wasn't simply another version of himself. He was a reflection of what Morty might become, if he chose patience, if he chose stillness over rushing. Eventually, Rick called out from across the field, his voice sharp against the calm. Morty, time to go. Morty stood reluctantly, brushing grass from his pants. The other Morty did not rise. He only closed his eyes again, settling back into his vigil. Will I see you again? Morty asked. The waiting Morty smiled faintly. You already do every time you pause long enough to listen. The words clung to him as he walked back to Rick, the shimmer of the portal waiting. He glanced over his shoulder one last time. The boy beneath the tree remained unmoving, patient, eternal. Back in his own room later that night, Morty lay awake for a while, staring at the ceiling. For the first time, he did not feel restless about the silence. He let it linger, stretching like the horizon of that golden field. And in the stillness, he felt the other Morty's presence, waiting quietly inside him. He drifted into sleep, not hurried but unhurried, as though time itself had learned to wait alongside him. The portals they stepped through stretched like corridors of light, and each one left a faint echo in Morty's ears. They had been walking for hours, or perhaps days, though time between dimensions was never easy to measure. Rick's mutterings grew quieter, his energy dimming as though every step pulled a little more weight from his bones. At last, they stopped. The space they entered was unlike any Morty had ever seen. It wasn't a planet, not exactly. It felt more like a pause between realities, a quiet ledge on the edge of existence. The air was still, touched with the scent of dust and something faintly sweet, like bread left to cool on a counter. Rick slumped down onto a rock that shimmered faintly, pulling his coat tighter. He sighed, heavy and low, then opened his battered pack. Morty expected some strange machine or a vial of glowing liquid. Instead, Rick pulled out a small loaf of bread, a wrinkled tomato, a container of something spreadable, and a dull knife. Morty blinked. You're making a sandwich. Rick didn't answer right away. He sliced the bread slowly, his movements deliberate. His hands, so often frenzied with invention, were steady now, almost gentle. He spread the filling, layered the slices, pressed the halves together with a soft finality. The silence stretched around them, comfortable in its plainness. When Rick finally spoke, his voice carried none of its usual sharpness. Even between universes, Morty. You've got to eat. He handed Morty the sandwich. It was simple, bread, tomato, something that tasted faintly like cheese but wasn't quite. Yet as Morty bit into it, the flavor felt grounding, ordinary, almost tender. He chewed slowly, realizing the meal carried something heavier than taste. Rick made another sandwich for himself. They sat side by side on the shimmering rock, eating in silence. The stars above pulsed faintly as though listening. Morty glanced at Rick, who was staring down at his food with a strange softness in his eyes. Morty wanted to ask why. 100 questions pressed at his tongue, but the stillness around them hushed him. Instead, he let the act speak for itself. Rick finally broke the quiet. You ever notice how food sticks with you differently? You don't remember equations, Morty. You don't remember coordinates, but you remember a taste, a smell, a sandwich someone handed you once. Morty nodded, his throat tight. He did remember. His mom making him peanut butter when he was younger. His dad fumbling with burnt toast, even tiny meals that felt like safety in ways words never could. And now this one. For a while they just ate. No rushing, no chaos. Only the sound of chewing, the faint crunch of bread, the quiet pulse of the stars. It felt like the simplest moment of their entire journey, and yet one of the most complete. When Morty finished, he licked the crumbs from his fingers. He wanted to say thank you, but the words felt too small, so he just leaned slightly against Rick's shoulder. Rick didn't move away. After a long pause, Rick murmured, "Don't think too much about it. It's just a sandwich." But Morty could hear what the words didn't say. It's not just a sandwich. It's a memory. A moment I don't want to lose. The stillness stretched, heavy and comforting. Eventually, Rick stood, brushing crumbs from his coat. He adjusted his pack, cleared his throat, and opened another portal. Morty followed, glancing back once at the rock where they had sat. The crumbs shimmered faintly, like stardust scattered across stone. The universe swallowed the place as they stepped forward, but the taste lingered. Warm, simple, unforgettable, a sandwich between universes. And though the journey would pull them into stranger places, Morty knew that no matter how far they drifted, he would carry that small meal in his chest like a lantern. Quiet, steady, always glowing. The taste of bread still lingered in Morty's mouth as they stepped through the next portal. For a moment, He thought the crumbs still clung to his fingers, though when he looked down only faint specks of light shimmered on his skin. This world was sky. Nothing but sky. Blue stretched endlessly above and below, so wide it made Morty feel both weightless and very small. Drifting through it were clouds of every shape and size, giant rolling masses and thin, delicate threads, each one glowing faintly as though lit from within. There was no ground, no horizon, only the sense that they had entered a place made entirely of breath. Rick adjusted his pack and muttered something under his breath, but Morty barely heard him. The clouds were moving in slow, deliberate patterns, almost like thoughts drifting across a resting mind. They didn't look random. They looked alive. Then Morty heard it, soft, faint, like a sigh carried across miles of air. His name, Morty. He froze, his heart lifting. The voice wasn't sharp or startling. It was as gentle as a lullaby hummed from far away. He turned toward the sound, and the nearest cloud seemed to swell, its edges rippling in the shape of lips, though only for an instant before returning to mist. Morty. He glanced at Rick, who was studying the clouds through narrowed eyes. "You hear that?" Morty asked. Rick grunted. "Yeah, don't pay attention. They're not talking to you. They're talking through you." Big difference, but Morty couldn't look away. The sound was too tender, too patient, as if the clouds carried not just his name, but every echo of it ever spoken. His mom calling him in for dinner. His sister whispering when she wanted help. Rick on rare occasions saying his name softer than usual. All of it swirled together in those drifting shapes. They walked or floated, or perhaps simply willed themselves forward through the endless sky. Sometimes Rick would pause to examine the air with a strange device, but Morty drifted closer to the clouds. They bent toward him like listeners, as though they recognized something in him. One great billow rolled beside him, pale and glowing. It formed a shape almost like an arm stretching out, and Morty lifted his hand toward it. The mist curled around his fingers, cool, damp, yet strangely comforting. He felt, for a brief moment, like he was holding the hand of something that understood him. "Morty." The cloud sighed again. Rick's voice cut through. "Don't get lost in it, Morty. That's how they work. They pull on memory, make you think you belong here. Nobody belongs in the mind of a cloud." But Morty wasn't afraid. The voices weren't pulling him away. They were guiding him inward, toward something soft inside himself he rarely touched. His hesitation, his empathy, his longing to be seen, these feelings seemed to rise and drift, mirrored by the glowing vapor around him. They traveled for what felt like hours, though time folded strangely here. Sometimes the clouds thickened into glowing walls, forcing them to squeeze through narrow corridors of mist. Other times they opened into vast, endless chambers, where the echoes of names, Morty's name, Rick's others, drifted like chimes in the wind. At one point Morty asked, "Why do they know my name?" Rick shrugged, his voice quieter than usual. "Clouds remember everything, Morty. They carry the breath of every word ever spoken. Out here, even your smallest sigh is eternal." Morty looked up at the drifting shapes, his chest swelling. "Even my smallest sigh." The idea filled him with a strange peace. They stopped once to rest upon a particularly dense cloud that held their weight like a soft bed. Morty lay back, staring into the endless blue above. The vapor was cool against his skin, and he could feel it vibrating faintly, as though singing some song only the sky could hear. Rick sat nearby, fiddling with a broken device, though Morty noticed his eyes drifting shut once or twice. For a man who never stopped thinking, this place seemed to hush him too. "Morty," came the whisper again, lower this time, like the earth itself humming. Morty let his eyes close. He didn't resist the sound. It was like being wrapped in a memory that belonged not to the past, but to the present moment itself. When he opened them again, the clouds were shifting, parting to reveal a slow spiral ahead, a path deeper into the sky. Rick rose, motioning for Morty to follow. As they walked into the spiral, the whispers grew softer, less insistent. The clouds seemed to bless them as they passed, brushing their shoulders, trailing their names like ribbons in the air. Finally, after what might have been a lifetime, they reached the end. The spiral tightened into a small clearing where the sky turned still, and in the center was a single glowing orb, like a lantern made of condensed mist. Rick studied it with fascination, muttering about atmospheric memory and quantum echo chambers, but Morty simply stared. The orb pulsed faintly with light, and in each pulse he heard his name one last time. Not a command, not a lure, just recognition, Morty. He smiled faintly, whispering back, "Yeah, I'm here." And then, as gently as it began, the whisper faded. Rick pocketed the orb, shook his head, and opened a new portal. Morty followed, glancing back only once at the infinite sky. The clouds still drifted, whispering faintly to themselves, carrying names into eternity. As he stepped through, Morty realized that the memory of this place would stay with him. Not heavy, not frightening, but like the aftertaste of a song. The sandwich had grounded him. The clouds had called his name. And somewhere between those two, he felt himself changing, softly, quietly, like air reshaping itself into something new. The portal closed behind them, and silence unfolded. It wasn't the silence of a resting sky or the hush of drifting clouds. This was deeper, an emptiness that pressed against the skin, so still that even Morty's breath felt loud. The ground was pale, made of stone that seemed never to end. No trees, no cities, no stars above, just a dim horizon that never shifted. Morty rubbed his arms, a shiver moving through him. "Where are we?" Rick didn't answer right away. He stood with his hands in his pockets, gaze fixed on the distance. His expression was hard to read, but there was something in his eyes Morty hadn't seen before. A flicker of recognition, maybe even dread. Finally, Rick muttered, "Not where, who?" Morty frowned, but before he could ask, a figure appeared on the horizon. Slowly it approached. A man with white hair, bent shoulders, and a coat that dragged along the stone. Another Rick. But unlike the others, this Rick carried no gadgets, no flask, no spark of manic brilliance. His hands hung loosely at his sides, and his eyes looked down, not up. He walked as though the world was weight, and he was tired of carrying it. When he reached them, he stopped, lifting his gaze just enough to look at Morty. His voice, when it came, was dry and slow. "So you found me?" Rick crossed his arms. "Didn't come looking. Just passing through," the lonely Rick. Morty couldn't help but think of him that way. Let out a small, humorless chuckle. Nobody passes through here unless they mean to. They stood in silence for a while, the air heavy with something unspoken. Morty shifted uneasily. This Rick felt different. Not sharp, not cruel, not even curious. Just hollow. At last, Morty asked softly, "Why do you live here, by yourself?" The lonely Rick's eyes moved to him, and for a moment Morty thought he saw a glimmer of warmth. But then it faded, replaced by the tired look again. "Because it's easier," the Rick said. "Easier than explaining. Easier than pretending. Easier than watching every version of yourself make the same mistakes." Rick beside Morty scoffed. Typical. Call it wisdom when it's really just giving up. But the lonely Rick didn't rise to the jab. He just lowered himself onto the pale stone, sitting with his knees bent, staring out at the horizon. Morty hesitated, then slowly sat beside him. Up close, he could see the lines in the man's face, deep, carved not just by time, but by absence. His coat was patched in places, his shoes worn thin, and yet there was something fragile about him, something almost tender. "Don't you get lonely?" Morty asked. The Rick's lips pressed into a thin smile. "All the time. But it's a clean loneliness. Better than the noise of people who never really see you." Morty lowered his head. He thought of the clouds whispering his name, of the sandwich Rick had made, of the quiet bonds that were slowly building in his heart. The idea of choosing emptiness over connection made his chest ache. He whispered, almost to himself, "I think being seen even just a little is worth the noise." For the first time, the lonely Rick turned to look directly at him. His eyes were wet, though no tears fell. He held Morty's gaze for a long moment, then nodded slightly, as though Morty had spoken a truth he couldn't deny. Rick cleared his throat, shifting impatiently. "Enough sentimental nonsense. Morty, we've got places to be." But Morty stayed seated a moment longer. He wanted to offer something, even if small. He rummaged through his pack and found a single crumb of the bread left from their sandwich. He set it down beside the lonely Rick. "It's not much," Morty said quietly, "but it's something." The lonely Rick stared at the crumb. His lips trembled, then curved into the faintest smile. He didn't thank Morty, but the look in his eyes said enough. When Morty finally rose to follow his own Rick, the silence of the pale world seemed different, not empty, but holding something now. A trace of kindness, a small act left behind. As they stepped through the next portal, Morty looked back once. The lonely Rick was still sitting, still staring at the horizon, but the crumb of bread glowed faintly in the dimness, as though even loneliness had been touched by light. The portal shimmered open, and sound met them before sight. Not loud sound, no crash, no roar. Just a faint hum, as though the air itself was breathing in melody. Morty blinked as he stepped through, finding himself in a chamber unlike anything he'd seen before. It was round, its walls made of polished metal, yet the surfaces rippled faintly like water. Lights glowed in soft colors, blue, pink, pale gold, pulsing gently with the rhythm of the sound. At the center stood a machine. It wasn't frightening, not like so many of Rick's other inventions. This one looked almost fragile, with thin silver arms that stretched upward like branches, holding small glass spheres that shimmered faintly. Each sphere vibrated, releasing a tone, and together they wove a song that filled the chamber. Morty stopped walking, his body sinking into the sound. It wasn't music in the way he knew it. There were no notes, no melody he could hum, but it felt like a lullaby. The kind of sound that reminded him of rocking chairs, of night air drifting through open windows, of being tucked in when he was younger. "Whoa," he whispered. "What is this place?" Rick adjusted his coat and gave the machine a long look. "Prototype," he said softly. "An old project. Haven't seen it in years." Morty glanced at him. "Cleosteson made this?" Rick didn't answer right away. His eyes stayed on the glass spheres reflecting the light. "It wasn't meant to last, just something I built one night when I couldn't sleep." The hum deepened like a sigh of recognition. Morty felt the sound in his chest, in his bones, even in his breath. His body grew heavy, but not unpleasantly so. It was the heaviness of rest, the weight of a blanket pulled across tired shoulders. He sat down on the smooth floor, leaning back against the wall. The vibration moved through him, and his eyes grew half-lidded. For the first time in a long while, he wasn't worried about what was coming next. The machine shifted. One of the glass spheres tilted toward Morty, its glow warming slightly. The hum rose and fell, and Morty realized it was singing to him. Not with words, but with care. He closed his eyes, breathing slowly. In the song, he heard echoes of his mother's voice, faint but familiar. He heard the laughter of his sister. He even heard the rare softness in Rick's voice, hidden beneath layers of sarcasm. All of it carried inside the hum, woven together. Rick watched from where he stood. For once, he didn't interfere. His usual impatience was absent. He just leaned against the wall, listening. His face was unreadable, but the shadows under his eyes seemed to lighten. Morty whispered without opening his eyes. "It feels like it knows me." Rick exhaled through his nose. "It doesn't know you, Morty. It just mirrors. It takes what you've felt and plays it back in a way you can hear." Morty thought about that. Mirrors, maybe that was true. But the feeling in his chest didn't care about explanations. He let the sound wash over him, like water smoothing out the sharp edges inside. They stayed there for what felt like hours, though time blurred in the song. Morty drifted in and out of thought, sometimes nearly asleep, sometimes awake enough to glance at Rick, who never left his place by the wall. Rick's gaze was far away, but there was something almost childlike in the way he stood so still, letting himself be surrounded by the lullaby. At one point, Morty whispered, "Do you think it could help people?" "Like really help them?" Rick's jaw tightened. "Maybe once, but nobody wanted it. Too simple, too quiet. They wanted lasers, Morty. They wanted chaos." Morty frowned. "But this feels important." Rick didn't respond, but Morty noticed his hand twitch slightly at his side, as if reaching for something long gone. The hum softened gradually, like dusk settling over a sky. One by one, the glass spheres dimmed, until only a faint glow remained, like embers after a fire. The silence that followed wasn't empty. It was warm, lingering, as if the song had left its imprint in the air. Morty stood slowly, still heavy with rest. He placed a hand against the machine, its surface cool beneath his palm. "Thank you," he whispered. The machine gave no reply, but a faint vibration answered under his hand. Rick finally straightened, cleared his throat, and opened a new portal. His voice, though, was quieter than usual. "Come on, Morty, we can't stay here forever." As they stepped toward the light, Morty glanced back. The machine stood silent, its arms reaching upward, its spheres dim but patient. He had the strange feeling that it would still be there, humming to itself, long after they were gone, singing to no one, and to everyone. The sound followed Morty into the portal, faint and steady, like the last line of a lullaby that refuses to fade. The lullaby faded as they stepped from the portal, leaving behind a silence that felt almost too sharp. Morty blinked, expecting another strange world of glowing skies or endless stone, but instead found something eerily familiar: a neighborhood street. The air smelled of grass and warm pavement. Houses lined the road, each with its tidy yard and fences painted in colors both dull and bright. It looked so ordinary that Morty's chest ached with homesickness. "Rick," he whispered, this looks like home." Rick frowned, scanning the street with narrowed eyes. "Looks like it. But don't get comfortable. Nothing's ever exactly what it seems." They walked slowly, their steps crunching against gravel. Morty's heart pounded. He had been drifting through clouds that whispered his name, machines that hummed lullabies, but this was different. This was the echo of his own world, the one place he never thought he'd see again outside of memory. A front door creaked open. Morty froze. A figure stepped onto the porch, squinting in the light. It was Beth, but not his Beth. Her hair was shorter, her clothes different. An apron dusted with flour, a softness around her face that his mother rarely carried at home. Yet when her eyes met his, Morty felt something sharp and tender twist inside. She looked at him the way a sister might, with recognition that wasn't quite recognition, with love that didn't need to be explained. "Morty," she said softly. He opened his mouth, but no words came. Rick muttered under his breath, "Variant figures." He turned away, fiddling with his portal gun. The Beth walked closer, her gaze never leaving Morty's. She stopped just a few feet away, kneeling slightly so her eyes met his at level. "You look so much like my brother," she whispered. "But you're not him, are you?" Morty shook his head slowly. "No, I'm from somewhere else." His voice trembled. For a moment her face flickered with grief. Then, just as quickly, it softened into something gentler. She reached out, brushing a stray bit of hair from his forehead. "Doesn't matter. You feel like him." Morty's chest tightened. He wanted to collapse into her arms, to believe that here in this version of the world he had a sister who saw him so clearly, but he held himself still, afraid that moving too quickly would break the fragile magic of the moment. They sat together on the porch steps. Rick hovered nearby, silent but restless. The Beth spoke quietly, asking him questions, not about science or dimensions, but about him. Did he like stories? Did he ever look at the stars? What made him feel safe? Morty answered in halting whispers, each response carrying more than words. And as they spoke, he felt the bond grow, not exactly the bond of siblings, but the echo of it. A warmth that filled a hollow space inside him. At one point she smiled faintly and said, "You don't always have to understand someone's words to know their heart." Morty's throat closed. That sentence would stay with him. Time drifted strangely in this place. The sky shifted from day to dusk without warning, the colors melting like paint in water. Lanterns flickered on in the houses nearby, though no other figures appeared. It was as if this street had been built only for them, for Morty to remember what family could feel like, and for Beth to glimpse her brother again, if only for a moment. Eventually, Rick cleared his throat. "We should go." Morty looked at him, then back at Beth. He didn't want to leave. His body felt heavy with longing, but he could see in her eyes that she understood. This moment was meant to be brief, a gift, not a place to stay. Beth reached into her pocket and pulled out a small pendant, a simple piece of glass, shaped like a teardrop strung on a thin cord. She pressed it into Morty's hand. "Take this. My brother would have wanted you to have it." Morty stared at it, then at her. I don't know what to say." She smiled sadly. "You don't have to. Just remember." Morty nodded, clutching the pendant tightly. His eyes burned, but no tears fell. Rick opened the portal, its green light spilling across the porch. Morty stepped toward it, then turned back one last time. Beth stood in the doorway, her hand raised in a quiet wave. For a heartbeat, she looked exactly like his sister, his own Beth, and Morty let that vision carry him through the light. The world dissolved. On the other side, the pendant in his hand glowed faintly, catching the dim light of their next destination. Morty held it close, his chest full of both ache and warmth. In another world he had found a sister, and in the soft silence of memory, she would always remain. The pendant still warmed in Morty's palm as they stepped into the next world. The portal closed behind them with its familiar sigh, leaving a hush that seemed heavier than usual. Rick didn't speak, though Morty could see him glance at the pendant once or twice, his expression unreadable. The landscape stretched wide and pale before them. Fields of soft grass rippled like water under a dim silver sky. In the distance, strange trees rose, each one glowing faintly from within, as though carrying a quiet fire inside their trunks. Morty stared, caught between wonder and melancholy. "Rick," he whispered, "why does it all feel like remembering?" Rick grunted, lighting something small in his hand, though he didn't smoke it. "Worlds bleed. Places carry echoes. Maybe you're finally noticing." They walked until the grass gave way to a clearing. In the center stood an old lantern. Its frame was bronze, worn smooth by time, its glass unbroken though fogged by age. Morty felt drawn to it immediately, as though it had been waiting for him. "Careful," Rick muttered. "Not everything you pick up out here is meant to be picked up." But Morty stepped closer anyway. The lantern's handle was cold under his fingers, yet when he lifted it, a soft light bloomed inside. No flame, no spark. It was as though the lantern simply remembered how to glow. Morty gasped. The glow shifted colors, pale gold to soft blue to a faint green that reminded him of portals. Shapes formed faintly within the light. Faces, moments, things he knew were not entirely his but still felt true. "Rick," Morty whispered, holding it up. "It's memories. I can see them." Rick squinted, stepping nearer. His face twitched with something Morty rarely saw: hesitation. "Not memories," he said slowly. "Reflections. Lantern of memory. I've heard about it. Old tech, or maybe not tech at all. No one really knows." Morty watched as the glow shifted again, this time showing Beth, the Beth he had just left, smiling as she handed him the pendant. His throat tightened. The lantern pulsed, then dimmed, waiting. Morty realized it wasn't showing him just anything. It was responding to what he held inside, offering back fragments of connection, of loss, of comfort. For a long time they stood in silence. Even Rick didn't move, his usual impatience quieted by the strange reverence of the moment. "Rick," Morty said softly, do you think this is supposed to be mine?" Rick stared at the lantern, his mouth twitching as though he wanted to make a joke, to dismiss it. But no words came. Instead, after a pause, he muttered, "Maybe it's been waiting for you." Morty hugged the lantern close. Its glow steadied, warm against his chest. They continued their journey, Morty carrying the lantern in one hand and the pendant in the other. As they walked through the glowing trees, the lantern cast gentle shapes on the ground. Patterns of stars, faint outlines of doors, even the suggestion of faces Morty couldn't fully name. It was like walking through the corridors of a dream, each step surrounded by fragments of memory that didn't belong only to him. At one point he glanced at Rick. For a fleeting moment, the lantern painted a younger version of Rick's face against the air beside him, a Rick with less wear in his eyes, laughing with someone unseen. Rick stiffened, turning away quickly, but Morty caught the look in his eyes before it vanished. The lantern did not lie. It remembered for all who walked beside it. As night deepened, if it could be called night in that silver sky, Morty set the lantern down in the grass while they rested. Its glow spread outward, gentle and steady like a heartbeat. Rick sat across from him, tinkering with something half-heartedly, though his gaze kept slipping back to the light. Morty whispered, almost to himself, "I think it's not just about remembering. It's about carrying. Like, you don't always get to keep people, but you can keep their light." Rick looked at him then, really looked. His mouth twitched again, but this time, instead of words, he just gave a faint nod. Morty lay down beside the lantern. Its glow warmed his face, softer than any blanket. He closed his eyes, and though he didn't sleep, he drifted into something close to it. A waking dream where everything felt connected, held, safe. When they rose to leave, Morty picked the lantern up again. Its weight felt natural in his hand, as though it had always belonged there. The light inside steadied, no longer shifting so wildly. It had chosen its keeper. Rick opened the next portal. Morty stepped toward it, lantern in hand, pendant still close to his chest. For the first time in a long while, He felt that he wasn't just traveling. He was carrying something forward, something that would remind him who he was, and who he had loved along the way. The light followed him into the green swirl, never faltering. The lantern flickered softly in Morty's hand as they stepped into a quieter world. Compared to the glowing fields of the last place, this realm seemed subdued. Narrow paths winding through pale stone, air heavy with stillness. The silence was so deep it felt fragile, as though even a loud breath might break it. Rick muttered about coordinates under his breath, but Morty hardly heard. His attention clung to the way the lantern's light fell in gentle circles, steady and patient. It reminded him of breathing. For a long stretch of their walk, nothing stirred. Then in the distance Morty saw them, figures crouched near the ground, bent over broken things. Their faces were thin, eyes weary, hands fumbling in the dim. They didn't look up when Rick and Morty approached, as if too tired to notice. Another broken world pocket, Rick muttered. People stuck between shifts of reality. No real exit, no real beginning, just waiting. Morty hesitated. He wanted to walk past, to avoid the heaviness in their still faces. But the lantern tugged gently in his palm as if urging him forward. Its light brightened, spilling across the stones until one of the figures finally looked up. Their eyes met Morty's, dull at first, then faintly alive, catching a spark from the glow. Without thinking, Morty knelt down and held the lantern out. The figure reached toward it, not touching, only basking in the warmth it offered. Their hands stopped trembling. Their shoulders eased. Slowly, the others around them lifted their faces too, drawn toward the quiet circle of light. Rick watched from a distance, his expression unreadable. He didn't interrupt. Morty stayed there silent, letting the lantern shine. He didn't offer explanations or promises he couldn't keep. He simply held the light, steady, long enough for their breathing to calm. One by one, the figures leaned back, closing their eyes, as if remembering something gentle they had forgotten. When it was time to leave, Morty rose carefully. The figures didn't cling to him or call out. They only bowed their heads, their stillness now touched by something softer. Rick caught up as Morty stepped back onto the path. "You didn't fix anything," Rick said, his tone almost defensive. Morty looked at him, holding the lantern close. "I didn't need to. Sometimes it's enough just being there." Rick said nothing more, but for a long time after, he walked slower, matching Morty's steps. As they moved deeper into the stone paths, Morty began to notice small details. How the walls hummed faintly when touched. How cracks in the stone glowed faintly like veins of memory. Each time he lifted the lantern, it seemed to answer the place itself, reminding it to breathe. And each time Morty felt a little less afraid of being so small in so wide a world. Later, when they stopped to rest, Rick sprawled against a slanted wall, tools scattered across his lap. Morty sat nearby with the lantern at his side. Its light reached across the gap between them, softening Rick's shadow. Rick finally muttered, "Most people think courage is loud. You know, charging into danger, swinging fists, shouting big speeches. But you—" He trailed off, scratching at the metal in his hand. "You don't make noise. You just stay, even when it hurts." Morty looked down, embarrassed, but he didn't interrupt. Rick rarely spoke like this. Rick sighed, still not meeting his eyes. That kind of courage, it's rare. Don't lose it. The lantern glowed warmer, as if it agreed. They moved on, and the path opened into a cavern where pale water pooled, reflecting faint stars etched into the ceiling. Morty lifted the lantern, and the stars seemed to shimmer brighter, responding to him. He felt a strange certainty then that his courage wasn't just about facing fear. It was about carrying light, steady and gentle, into places that had forgotten it. When Rick opened the next portal, Morty stepped through first, lantern held high. The swirl of green bent around the light, softening its usual chaos. Morty realized he wasn't just following anymore. He was carrying something forward, something even Rick couldn't build or explain. And though he said nothing, his heart felt stronger than it ever had before. The lantern's glow guided them through the next world, as though it knew the way better than either of them. Its circle of light spread across the floor of a dim corridor, illuminating walls lined with strange carvings, half equations, half lullabies etched into stone. The air smelled of dust and quiet, like a library where time itself had fallen asleep. Morty walked close to Rick, who muttered something about temporal leakage under his breath. But even Rick's voice sounded smaller here. The corridor opened at last into a wide chamber. At its center sat an old man bent over a table. His lab coat was frayed, his hair wild but thinning, his hands trembling as they fumbled with a screwdriver he couldn't seem to hold steady. Morty froze. He knew that face. "Rick," Morty whispered. The old man looked up slowly. His eyes were pale, clouded with forgetfulness. For a moment he blinked as though seeing them through mist. Then he smiled faintly. "Morty," he said, though his voice cracked. "You've grown." Rick stiffened beside Morty. He didn't speak, but Morty felt the tension in him, sharp as wires pulled too tight. The old man set the screwdriver down and leaned back, his movements uncertain. "I was working on something, but I don't remember what. Or maybe I already finished it." His laugh was soft, fragile. "That happens a lot now." Morty stepped closer, holding the lantern high. Its light softened the wrinkles of the old Rick's face, making him look less broken, more human. "Do you live here all alone?" The old Rick shrugged. "Sometimes I think I had company. A girl, or maybe a boy, a Morty. But they drift in and out. My head's a leaky roof." He tapped the side of his temple. "Rain goes in, memories slip out." Morty's throat ached. He wanted to say something comforting, but the words caught. So instead, he sat beside the old man, placing the lantern gently on the table between them. The glow filled the room, steady and calm. For a while they just sat in silence. The old Rick traced the light on the table with his trembling fingers, as though it was something precious he couldn't name. Rick finally spoke from the shadows, his voice gruff. "You've lost coherence," he muttered. "Memory decay from too many jumps, maybe from neglect. Either way," he trailed off. His words were sharp, but his eyes betrayed something else. Fear, perhaps, or grief he didn't want Morty to see. The old Rick chuckled faintly. "You sound like me. Or maybe I sound like you. I forget who came first." He leaned closer to the lantern, eyes reflecting the glow. "But light. Light I remember. That never leaves." Morty reached out, placing his hand gently over the old man's. The trembling eased just slightly. "It's okay," Morty whispered. "You don't have to remember everything. Maybe it's enough to just be here now." The old Rick looked at him, eyes wet with something softer than confusion. He nodded slowly. "You're kind," he said. "My Morty was kind too." Behind them, Rick shifted. Morty glanced back, catching his expression in the lantern light. For once, Rick's walls seemed thinner, his sharpness dulled. He looked at the old man not as a problem to solve, but as a mirror of what he might one day become. They stayed with the old Rick until his eyes grew heavy. He leaned back in his chair, breathing slow, a faint smile on his face as the lantern's glow washed over him. "Feels like a lullaby," he murmured. "If I forget everything else, let me remember this," Morty whispered back. "You will." When the old man finally drifted into sleep, Morty lifted the lantern again. Rick opened the portal quietly, almost reverently. As they stepped through, Morty looked back one last time. The old Rick lay in his chair, bathed in gentle light, peaceful in his forgetting. Rick didn't speak until they were on the other side. Even then, his voice was softer than usual. Don't expect me to end up like that," he muttered. Though the words felt more like a wish than a certainty, Morty didn't answer. He just held the lantern tighter, letting its steady glow remind him that even in forgetting, there could be gentleness, and even in endings, there could be light. The air shifted as the portal opened, thick with salt and a hush that seemed to stretch forever. Morty stepped forward, lantern in hand, and felt the ground dissolve beneath him. He was standing on something that was not stone or soil but reflection, an endless mirror of water, stretching to every horizon, silver in the dim light. The sea was not still. Shapes moved across its surface, rippling like shadows of lives being lived. At first Morty thought they were illusions, but as his eyes adjusted, he realized what he was seeing. Faces, his own, rising out of the water, sinking back in, drifting across the surface like gentle waves. Countless Mortys, each slightly different yet all recognizable. Some older, some younger, some smiling, some heavy-eyed, a few holding lanterns like his, though most empty-handed. It was like walking into a dream where every possibility of himself had been gathered together, waiting. Morty's breath caught. His lantern pulsed softly as though steadying him. Rick stepped out behind him, muttering something sharp under his breath, but even his words fell quiet in the vastness of the sight before them. Morty turned, and in the distance he saw them too, Ricks, scattered like constellations across the water's skin, some standing tall, some hunched, some so faded they were little more than outlines. The sea of variance stretched forever. A quiet tide of selves. Morty's knees wobbled. "Rick, what is this place?" Rick shoved his hands into his coat pockets, his face unreadable. "It's not a place, Morty, it's a mirror. Every choice, every slip, every echo, they gather sometimes. Like condensation. Variance, memories, all dripping back into the same ocean." Morty's eyes swept the horizon. "There's so many of me. I don't even know which one is me." The lantern glowed warmer in his hand, answering his fear. Its circle of light reflected across the water, and wherever it touched, the drifting Mortys stilled, gazing back at him with calm recognition. Morty swallowed hard. "Do they know me?" "Maybe," Rick muttered. "Maybe you know them." Morty stepped forward, his shoes barely sinking into the mirrored surface. The lantern's glow stretched, and one of the Mortys reached toward it. Their hands didn't meet, separated by the skin of the water, but Morty felt the gesture like a whisper. "We are the same and we are different, and both are true." The weight in his chest loosened. They walked farther, weaving between quiet gatherings of variance. Some Mortys sat together in small circles, humming tunes Morty almost remembered. Others drifted alone, their eyes tired but gentle. The Ricks were stranger, some muttering equations into the water, others simply lying back as if waiting to dissolve. A few glanced at Morty and his Rick, their expressions flickering with recognition or dismissal. It was overwhelming but not frightening. The sea was too calm, too endless, to be anything but reverent. At one point Morty stopped. He had spotted a Morty not much older than himself, kneeling with a lantern almost identical to his. Their eyes met, and for a long time neither spoke. Then the other Morty gave a small nod as if to say, "Carry it well." Morty nodded back. Rick watched the exchange from a few steps away. His jaw clenched, but he didn't interrupt. Eventually they reached a place where the water rose into gentle swells, like the breath of the sea itself. Morty sat at the crest of one, and let the lantern rest beside him. Its glow spread outward, rippling across the mirrored water, until countless faces shimmered in the reflection. For the first time, Morty didn't feel lost among them. He felt accompanied. Rick sat too, though he faced away, staring at a cluster of his own variants who stood in silence at the horizon. His shoulders slumped. Morty wondered if he felt the same quiet ache, the reminder that even among infinite versions, loneliness could still linger. Morty spoke softly, not sure if the words were for Rick, for himself, or for all the reflections around them. "It's okay not to be the only one. Maybe it means we don't have to carry everything alone." The sea shimmered faintly as though agreeing. After a long silence, Rick muttered almost grudgingly, "Don't get too poetic." "Morty." But his voice lacked its usual sharpness. They stayed there until the light of the lantern began to dim, not dying but settling like a heartbeat finding rest. Morty lifted it again, and the sea of variance rippled in farewell. When Rick finally opened the next portal, Morty looked back once more at the endless faces, the infinite selves drifting across silver water. Instead of fear, he felt a quiet peace. He didn't need to know which one was the real him. The lantern was proof enough that his path mattered, however small. And with that he stepped into the green swirl, carrying the light forward, one among many, but still entirely himself. The portal opened with less sound than a sigh. Morty stepped through first, lantern steady in his hand, and found himself standing not on stone nor water nor shifting metal corridors, but on grass. Grass unlike any he had ever seen. It glowed faintly, as though each blade carried its own hidden memory of sunlight. The air was cool, scented with something like lavender and something older still, a fragrance that carried both newness and nostalgia. Before him stretched a garden. It did not end. It folded over the horizon in soft waves, not manicured but wild in its gentleness. Trees with silver bark leaned toward one another like quiet companions. Flowers opened slowly, their petals drifting upward rather than down. The sky was not a sky at all, but a dome of shifting colors, galaxies blooming and fading as if painted fresh each breath. Morty froze, lantern light flickering against the nearest tree. "Rick, where are we?" Rick emerged from the portal, his usual scowl softened by the sight. For once he didn't answer immediately. He let his gaze wander over the impossible landscape, as though reluctant to disturb it with words. When he finally spoke, his voice was lower than usual. "The edge," Rick said. "Not of one universe. Of all of them. Where things that don't belong anymore come to rest." Morty's heart trembled. He looked around again, noticing that between the glowing grasses and drifting blossoms were shapes he recognized, half-familiar objects resting as if they'd grown from the soil itself. A toy spaceship weathered and bent. A half-empty flask, its glass catching the dome light like a jewel. A single shoe far too small for him now, but so like one he had lost as a child. Each relic hummed faintly with meaning, though no explanation was offered. They walked slowly. Morty held the lantern close, but he realized he didn't need it here. The garden seemed to shine with its own quiet luminescence, like a place that had never known fear. The air moved around him with a rhythm, a breath, and he felt, for the first time in a long while, entirely safe. "Is this where endings happen?" Morty asked softly. Rick shrugged, though his eyes betrayed a heaviness. "Maybe. Or maybe it's where endings remember themselves." Big difference. They came upon a clearing where the grass bent low, creating a natural circle. In the center was a tree unlike the others, its trunk vast, its branches stretching so high they seemed to braid with the stars in the dome above. From its branches hung countless small lights, each glowing with a hue Morty couldn't quite name. Some pulsed like laughter, others flickered like memories of tears. Together they looked like a map of something too big to grasp. Morty felt his throat tighten. "Rick, so those," Rick cut in gently. "Memories. Or maybe lives. Or maybe just stories that got tired and wanted a place to sleep." Morty stepped closer. The light swayed, though there was no wind. As he gazed at one that shone with a soft golden hue, he felt warmth pass through him. A flash of being held as a child, a laugh from his sister, the quiet sound of pages turning late at night. None of these belonged fully to him, and yet they felt like his, like fragments gifted to whoever was willing to listen. He whispered, "It's beautiful." Rick didn't answer. Morty glanced back and saw his grandfather's face tilted up toward the branches, his expression raw in a way Morty had never seen. The old man's eyes glistened faintly, though he blinked it away before Morty could speak. They stayed in the clearing for what felt like hours, maybe lifetimes. Time did not move here in any way Morty recognized. Sometimes he thought he heard voices, gentle ones, singing lullabies not with words but with tone. Other times he thought he saw shadows, not frightening but tender, moving between the flowers as though checking on each bloom. Eventually Morty sat beneath the great tree, resting the lantern beside him. He leaned back against the trunk and felt it hum with a pulse older than any universe. His eyelids grew heavy, though he wasn't tired. It was the kind of heaviness that came when you finally felt you could rest. Rick sat beside him, cross-legged, flask forgotten at his side. For a long while they said nothing. And then Morty spoke, voice barely above a whisper. "Rick, do you think we'll end here one day?" Rick was silent for a stretch. Then, almost reluctantly, he said, "If we're lucky." Morty smiled faintly. "It wouldn't be so bad." Rick gave a quiet grunt, but Morty thought he caught the smallest trace of agreement in it. They lingered until the dome above shifted into colors Morty had no name for. The garden seemed to breathe with them, as though it too was waiting for whatever came next. Morty gathered his lantern again, though its glow looked dim compared to the lights in the tree. Still he held it firmly. As they rose to leave, Morty turned once more to the vast garden, to the flowers, the relics, the lights hanging from endless branches. He felt a warmth spread through his chest, not the heat of fire but the gentleness of belonging. For all the strange roads they had walked, all the shadows and echoes, it was this place, the quiet garden at the edge of universes, that reminded him who he was becoming. Rick opened the portal. Morty stepped through with one last glance, carrying the memory of the garden like a folded note in his pocket, knowing he would unfold it again in dreams. The portal closed behind them with the sound of a sigh, and for the first time in what felt like forever, the air smelled ordinary. Morty blinked and looked around. No shimmering skies, no infinite reflections of himself, no councils gathered in shadows. Just a kitchen, Not their kitchen, not exactly, but a kitchen shaped out of memory. The walls were pale yellow, like the ones from his childhood home. The window above the counter looked out onto no real yard, only a soft glow that suggested one might be there if you believed hard enough. The table was wooden, its surface scarred with years of use, but it radiated a warmth that no polished metal surface ever could. Rick shuffled across the room without a word, shoulders slouched but not weary. He opened cupboards that seemed to know what he wanted before he touched them. Bread appeared, fresh and whole, its crust golden brown. A jar of mustard, cheese that gave off a faint scent of comfort. Morty realized with a sudden jolt that he had no memory of Rick ever cooking, ever preparing food with intention. The man who could build galaxies had never really taken the time to make a simple sandwich. Morty sat down slowly at the table. He watched in silence, his hands folded, as Rick laid out the ingredients. The movements weren't efficient, not the sharp, precise gestures of a scientist at work. Instead, they were almost clumsy. An old man trying to recall the order of something he hadn't done in years. Knife spreading mustard unevenly, cheese slices stacked slightly crooked. He didn't curse or complain. He simply did it. The quiet filled the kitchen like another ingredient. Morty thought about all the places they had been, the infinite Mortys, the lonely Ricks, the glowing gardens. And yet here, in this almost real kitchen, time felt heavier, more precious. Rick set the sandwich on a plate. He didn't dress it up, didn't offer a speech. Just pushed it across the table with a muttered, "Eat." Morty looked at it. Bread, cheese, mustard, simple, ordinary. He picked it up and took a bite. The taste was everything it looked like, plain but good. And yet as he chewed, his eyes stung. He couldn't explain why. Maybe it was because this was the one thing he hadn't expected from Rick. A gesture not of genius or escape, but of care. Rick watched him eat, arms folded, expression unreadable. After a while, he poured himself a glass of water, sat down across from Morty, and joined him in silence. Two figures at a kitchen table in a place that wasn't real but mattered anyway. Morty swallowed and whispered, "Thanks, Rick." Rick grunted. "It's just a sandwich," but Morty shook his head. He knew it wasn't. The kitchen light flickered gently as if echoing the heartbeat of the moment. Morty ate slowly, each bite grounding him. He thought of the countless adventures, the chaos, the noise, and he realized that sometimes the rarest thing Rick could give was quiet. When the sandwich was gone, Morty sat back in his chair, hand resting on the empty plate. He closed his eyes and let the feeling wash over him. A small kindness, a fragile peace. Rick leaned back too, exhaling softly, as though he had been holding his breath for longer than either of them realized. For a while, neither moved. The kitchen seemed suspended in time, floating at the edge of all universes. No danger chased them. No questions demanded answers. Just a boy and his grandfather, sharing a meal at a table that belonged to no one and everyone. Finally, Morty spoke, voice quiet as if afraid to disturb the balance. "Do you think this is what it's supposed to feel like? Not the portals or the councils, but just being here?" Rick's gaze flicked to him, sharp for a moment, then softened. "Maybe, Morty. Maybe it's the little crap we never think about that ends up mattering most." Morty smiled faintly. The words weren't profound, not in the way lectures or discoveries could be. But they landed deeper. They felt like truth. The lantern Morty had carried all this way flickered faintly on the counter. Its glow mingled with the kitchen light until the two became indistinguishable. Morty thought about leaving it behind, letting it rest here, but he couldn't. Not yet. He reached for it, holding it close, the way a child clutches a keepsake. Rick rose, pushing his chair back with a scrape. He rinsed the plate, set it in the sink, and dried his hands on a towel that had always hung there, even if it never truly existed. Then he opened another portal. Its glow washed over the room like dawn breaking. Morty stood, lantern steady. He looked once more at the table, the chair, the unfinished loaf of bread. Ordinary, precious things. He tucked the memory away carefully, knowing it would stay with him long after universes forgot his name. "Come on," Rick muttered. Already stepping toward the light, Morty followed. And as the kitchen dissolved behind them, he carried the taste of that final sandwich with him, not on his tongue, but in his heart. The portal led them not into another marvel, but into quiet. The ground beneath their feet was smooth stone, pale as moonlight, stretching out into a wide, empty hall. No stars shone above. No walls surrounded them. Just the endless hush of a place that had forgotten echoes. At the far end of the hall, a figure sat slumped in a chair. Rick stopped short, shoulders stiff. Morty blinked, squinting. The figure looked familiar, too familiar. It was another Rick. This Rick's hair was thinner, whiter, and his coat hung from him like a memory stretched too far. His eyes were half closed, unfocused, and his hand trembled where it rested on the arm of the chair. Before them was a table littered with empty flasks, though none of them carried even a trace of shine anymore. Morty glanced at his Rick, but his grandfather said nothing. He only watched the figure in the chair, his mouth a tight line. The older Rick stirred faintly, head lifting just enough to notice them. His voice came low and cracked like a door rusted on its hinges. "You came late." Morty felt a shiver. There was no anger in the words, only exhaustion and something heavier, resignation. Rick didn't move closer. Morty hesitated, then stepped forward himself. The lantern glowed faintly in his hand, but its light seemed unnecessary in this place. He stopped a few feet away from the slumped figure. The old Rick's eyes met his for a moment. Then they drifted downward again. Morty wanted to speak, but the words caught in his throat. He thought of everything they'd seen. The Garden of Universes, the sandwich in the kitchen, the seas of variance. He thought of his Rick's rare softness. He thought of the loneliness that seemed to follow every version of this man like a shadow. He leaned closer. Not too close, just enough that his voice would carry without strain. And then softly he whispered, "It's okay." The old Rick blinked slowly as though the words took time to travel into him. Morty continued, his voice steady but low. "So you don't have to keep building or running or trying to be the smartest one in every room. You don't have to carry it all. You're allowed to rest. You're allowed to let someone else care." The old Rick's lips parted faintly. No words came out. His chest rose, then fell, a long exhale that trembled on its way down. Morty reached out and placed his hand lightly on the arm of the chair. Not gripping, not forcing, just there like a reminder. His whisper softened further, barely more than breath. "You've done enough. You are enough. You don't have to prove anything anymore." Rick shifted behind him, but Morty didn't turn. This moment wasn't about his Rick. It wasn't about councils or universes or portals. It was about this one man, this one soul who had forgotten what it felt like to be comforted. The silence stretched. Then, with a sound like old paper folding, the older Rick leaned back in the chair. His eyelids closed, not in defeat, but in release. The lines on his face loosened, his mouth softened, and his body stilled as though finally allowed to rest. Morty felt warmth spread from his chest into his arm, into his fingertips. It wasn't magic, not a portal, not a machine. It was simply presence. Simply kindness, he whispered once more, so quiet it might have been mistaken for air. "You're not alone." The lantern pulsed faintly, then steadied. Morty stayed there until he was sure the old Rick had slipped into gentle sleep, his breathing even and untroubled. Then he rose, careful not to disturb him. He turned back toward his Rick, who was still standing where he'd been, eyes unreadable. For once, Rick didn't speak. He only gave the smallest nod, as though acknowledging something Morty had done that he could never bring himself to. Morty held the lantern close. He didn't feel like a child in that moment. He didn't feel like a sidekick. He felt like someone who had given something real, something his grandfather and all his endless selves rarely allowed themselves to receive. The hall remained hushed, carrying no echoes, only peace. Rick opened another portal. Morty stepped toward it slowly, glancing back once at the figure resting in the chair. He whispered again, not for the man to hear but for himself, "Rest well," and then the light carried them away. The night sky opened above them like a page already written. Morty stepped out of the portal and gasped. They were standing on a ridge of rock, smooth and dark, with no trees, no grass, no horizon. Only stars, endless stars, spilling across the dome above and around them, as if the universe itself had leaned closer. Morty tilted his head back. These weren't the stars he knew from home. They pulsed differently. Each light seemed alive, trembling with a rhythm that felt personal. Some flared gently, others dimmed, some flickered in and out like shy candles. "Rick," he whispered, "are those all of them?" Rick's face was lit by the glow, his usual shadow softened into something fragile. He didn't answer right away. He dug his hands into his coat pockets, eyes scanning the sky. Finally, in a voice quieter than Morty expected, he said, "Yeah, they're the ones who came before, the ones who couldn't keep running, the ones who left something behind." Morty swallowed. He looked again, and this time the stars felt closer. He thought he saw patterns, not constellations but fragments of lives. A hand raising a flask, a laugh caught between teeth, a bent shoulder leaning over blueprints. Every star seemed to tell a story, not with words but with light. "Do they remember?" Morty asked, his chest tightening. Rick exhaled, a slow, shaky sound. "They don't forget. That's the thing about stars. They just keep burning, even when you wish they wouldn't. Every mistake, every spark of genius, every dumb joke, it gets folded in. And then it shines. For longer than we get to." They stood together in silence. The stars hummed faintly, not with noise but with presence. Morty felt something stir in him, something like awe but gentler, warmer. These weren't distant, unreachable lights. They felt close enough to touch, like a quilt spread out across the sky just to keep them safe. He thought of the Ricks they had seen, the lonely one, the forgotten one, the one he had whispered to. And he thought of his own Rick, standing beside him, stubborn and scarred, pretending not to feel but feeling all the same. Morty's voice trembled as he spoke. "Do you think you'll be up there too one day?" Rick's jaw tightened. He didn't answer at first. His eyes darted across the sky, as though searching for something he didn't want Morty to notice. Finally he muttered, "If I do, I hope it's not a bright one." Morty turned to him. "Why?" Rick's laugh was brittle. "Because the bright ones are the ones people notice. And noticing means remembering. And remembering means it hurts." Morty shook his head, the lantern glowing faintly in his hand. "No, Rick, it doesn't have to hurt. It just means you mattered. It means you were here." Rick didn't respond, but Morty thought he saw his grandfather's shoulders shift, just barely. They sat down on the ridge together, the stone cool beneath them. Morty lay back, resting the lantern beside him. The stars above seemed to lean closer in return, their light stretching softly over his face. He closed his eyes for a moment and could still see them, imprinted on the inside of his eyelids like tiny pulses of memory. Rick sat hunched beside him, elbows on knees, staring upward as though waiting for something. Morty didn't push. He just let the silence cradle them both. After a long while, Rick spoke, voice quieter than Morty had ever heard it. "Morty, if the stars do remember, don't let them remember me for what I built. Let them remember me for this, sitting here, with you." Morty's throat tightened. He nodded, though Rick wasn't looking at him. He whispered back, "They will, Rick, I promise." The stars seemed to shimmer brighter as though answering. Morty reached for the lantern and held it up. Its glow joined the vastness above, a tiny light folded into infinity. For a fleeting moment, it looked like the lantern was part of the sky, another star among countless others, carrying their story forward. They stayed there until Morty's eyelids grew heavy, not with exhaustion but with peace. When he finally rose, Rick stood too, brushing the dust from his coat. Neither of them spoke. They didn't need to. The stars had said enough. Rick opened the portal. Morty hesitated, glancing back one last time. The sky pulsed gently, as if nodding, as if keeping their secret. And then they stepped forward, leaving the stars behind, but knowing deep down that the stars would never leave them. The portal opened not onto stars, not into gardens, not even into familiar rooms. It opened into a field of soft grass, rolling under a sky that looked like dawn and dusk at once. Morty stepped through, lantern in his hand, and immediately felt the hush of the place. The air carried no chill, no heat, only balance. Rick followed, his footsteps heavy, though not from exhaustion. He stopped beside Morty, hands stuffed into his coat pockets, and gave the horizon a long look. "Where are we?" Morty asked, though his voice was barely more than a breath. Rick didn't answer right away. He tilted his head, squinting at the quiet colors above, then shrugged. "Somewhere that doesn't need a name." Morty let the words settle. He walked a little farther, feeling the grass bend and spring beneath his shoes. Each step felt lighter, as though the weight he had been carrying through countless universes had finally begun to slip away. They came upon a tree, tall and wide, its branches curved like open arms. Without speaking, Rick lowered himself to the ground beneath it, leaning back against the trunk. Morty hesitated, then sat beside him, setting the lantern down between them. Its glow mingled with the warm light of the sky until it was impossible to tell where one ended and the other began. Neither spoke for a long time. The silence was not awkward. It was the silence of belonging, of presence, of knowing nothing else was required. Morty lay back in the grass, staring up at the branches overhead. He thought of everything behind them, the councils, the variants, the whispers across dimensions. All of it seemed far away now, softened into memory. Rick shifted slightly, pulling his coat tighter around himself. His eyes were half closed, his breathing steady. Morty glanced at him and almost didn't recognize him. Not the genius, not the wanderer, just an old man leaning against a tree, finally letting himself be still. Morty's voice broke the quiet, low and uncertain. "Do you think we'll—" "Stop here." Rick gave a small grunt, neither yes nor no. After a while he said, "Maybe we don't need to stop. Maybe we just need to rest." For once. Morty let the words sink in. He turned onto his side, watching the lantern's glow. Its flame didn't flicker. It breathed slowly like a heartbeat. He found comfort in its steadiness. The grass rustled faintly around them, though there was no wind. Morty closed his eyes, listening. He thought he heard echoes. Not voices, not memories, but the sound of everything finally quieting. It was like the universe itself had decided to lie down beside them, exhaling after a long day. Rick's voice came softer than Morty expected. "You know, Morty, I've spent my whole life running, building, fixing, breaking, and none of it ever felt enough. But this—" He gestured faintly at the tree, the field, the hush. This might be." Morty swallowed hard. He didn't want to disturb the balance, but he whispered anyway. "I think so too, Rick." They sat together until the colors in the sky deepened. Morty felt his body grow heavier, not with fatigue, but with surrender. He let his head rest against the grass, eyes fluttering closed. Beside him, Rick's breathing slowed, falling into a rhythm that Morty had never heard before, a rhythm of peace. For the first time, Morty wasn't afraid to let go. Not of Rick, not of the journey, but of the need to keep moving. He understood now that rest was part of the story too. The lantern's glow dimmed, not extinguished, but softened. It no longer needed to light the way. Rick shifted one last time, his voice barely audible. "Sleep, Morty, just sleep," and Morty did. The field held them. The tree sheltered them. The sky watched over them. And for that long, endless moment, they rested, not as wanderers, not as variants, not as a genius and his grandson, but simply as two souls who had finally found quiet. The tree in the meadow held them through the long hours, and when Rick finally stirred, the sky had shifted again. The colors were neither dawn nor dusk this time, but something beyond time itself, a soft gray violet that seemed to belong to every hour at once. Morty's breathing was still steady beside him, the kind of breathing that comes when even dreams have grown quiet. Rick looked at him for a long while. The boy's face, softened by rest, carried no trace of the endless journeys. No fear of portals, no shadow of councils, no ache of multiversal echoes. Just peace. Rick leaned back against the tree and let his gaze drift upward. The branches swayed gently, though no wind moved them. Beyond their reach, stars appeared, slowly, one by one, as though shy about revealing themselves. Each glimmer seemed familiar, as if it held the reflection of 1,000 Ricks and 1,000 Mortys who had lived, laughed, quarreled, and loved in their own small ways. It struck him that they were never truly alone. Every version left something behind, some soft trace that lingered like starlight long after the moment had passed. Morty stirred, eyes blinking open. "Rick?" His voice was groggy, tender. "Yeah, kid? Are we done?" Rick thought about it. He rubbed at the back of his neck, sighed, and finally said, "Done isn't really the word. Stories don't end, Morty. They just drift, like echoes, like stars." Morty let his head fall back into the grass. He smiled faintly. "I like that better." The lantern between them pulsed softly, no longer needed but still present, like a memory that refuses to fade. Its light shimmered against their faces, wrapping them in warmth. They lay in silence again, but this time silence felt like conversation. The field itself seemed to whisper to them, carrying thoughts too gentle for words. Rick closed his eyes and let the sound wash over him, as if the universe were finally singing him a lullaby. Morty's hand shifted until it brushed against Rick's. Neither moved it away. They stayed like that, grounded by touch, bound by something stronger than explanations. After a time, Rick spoke again, his voice drifting like smoke. "You know, Morty, somewhere out there are versions of us still running, still fighting, still inventing. But here, we get to stop. And that's enough." Morty's reply was almost lost in the hush. "But we're still out there too, right?" Rick cracked a small, weary smile. "Yeah, kid, always." The stars above brightened, their light stretching across the sky until the field seemed to float within them. The meadow, the tree, the lantern, everything blurred at the edges, becoming softer, dreamlike. Rick's eyes grew heavy. Morty's did too. And as they drifted, the story itself began to dissolve, not with a bang, not with a farewell, but with a gentle exhale. Somewhere, in some quiet corner of infinity, they are still there, resting, breathing, sharing the simplest moments, the sandwiches, the whispers, the silences. Somewhere they are still out there, napping in the sun, wrapped in the hush of a universe that finally let them be. And maybe, if you look up at the stars tonight, you'll catch a glimpse of them, not as travelers, not as legends, just as two souls who found their way to rest. Thanks for spending this time with us. Sleep well. Everything's going to be okay, man.